This presentation is about model collapse, a phenomenon that arises when generative models are trained recursively on data produced by other models. In recent years, synthetic data has become a central component of large-scale model training. This shift has enabled impressive gains in skill and capability, but it has also introduced new and subtle failure modes. Model collapse refers to one such failure mode where successive generations of models gradually lose diversity, generalization ability, and coverage of rare patterns. In this talk, I will first explain why modern models increasingly rely on synthetic data. Then I will define model collapse and explain the underlying mechanism both intuitively and mathematically. Finally, I will discuss recent experimental evidence, mitigation strategies, and emerging perspectives that reinterpret model collapse not only as a problem but also as a potential tool. Modern foundation models are increasingly trained on large-scale synthetic datasets. As shown here, recent technical reports explicitly describe synthesizing trillions of tokens of high-quality data. For example, the Solar Open report states that more than 4.5 trillion tokens were synthesized for training. This scale is significant because synthetic data is no longer a small augmentation to real data. Instead, it has become a dominant component that shapes the learned distribution. Synthetic data is attractive because it is cheap to produce, easy to control, and can target specific domains such as reasoning, mathematics, or code. However, this also means that the training data increasingly reflects the biases and preferences of generating model rather than the external world. Synthetic data is now used across many modalities. On the left, we see synthetic reasoning datasets where models generate step-by-step explanations or chain of thought. In the center, we see synthetic tables where structured data is generated, corrected, or normalized by models. On the right, we even see synthetic medical images such as chest X-rays. This highlights an important topic. Model collapse is not limited to language models. Any generative system that repeatedly trains on its own outputs can experience similar dynamics. As synthetic data becomes widespread, understanding its long-term effects becomes essential. In the near future, and likely already today, models are being trained on data synthesized by models that were themselves trained on synthetic data. This creates a closed feedback loop. Over time, the training distribution becomes increasingly disconnected from the real-world data originally grounded the model. The central question is not whether this recursive process exists, but what its long-term behavior is. Model collapse provides one possible answer. This question was empirically studied in a 2024 Nature paper. The key finding was that AI models collapse when trained on recursively generated data. As generations progress, generated outputs become less diverse, more repetitive, and increasingly concentrated around high probability modes. This work established model collapse as a concrete and measurable phenomenon rather than a purely theoretical concern. Formally, model collapse is defined as a degenerative process affecting successive generations of generative models. In this process, data generated by one generation pollutes the training set of the next. The term pollution emphasizes that the issue is not incorrect labels or noise. Instead, the problem is systematic bias introduced by repeated sampling from learned distributions. Over time, this bias reshapes the dataset itself. This diagram illustrates the recursive training pipeline. We begin with real data and train an initial model. That model generates synthetic samples which are mixed back into the dataset. A new model is then trained on this mixture and the cycle repeats. As this process continues, the portion of real data decreases while synthetic data increasingly dominates. This recursive structure is the core setting in which model collapse occurs. Two systematic effects drive model collapse. First, frequent events are overrepresented. High probability patterns are sampled repeatedly and reinforced across generations. Second, rare events are underrepresented. Low probability patterns are less likely to be sampled and gradually disappear. This leads to a shrinking support of the data distribution, especially in the tails. There are three sources that contribute to model collapse. The first is statistical approximation error caused by finite sampling. Even a perfect model cannot recover patterns that are never sampled. The second is functional expressivity error, since real models cannot represent arbitrary distributions. The third is optimization error arising from limitations of learning algorithms such as stochastic gradient descent. Crucially, model collapse can occur even if the latter two sources are removed. To understand why model collapse is unavoidable under recursion, we analyze the process mathematically. We model learning as a stochastic process that evolves across generation, where each generation produces the data distribution for the next. At generation I, we assume a dataset composed of independent samples drawn from a distribution Pi. The dataset size is finite. This assumption is critical because finite sampling introduces randomness that accumulates over generations. The learning process is abstracted as a function fi, which maps the data distribution Pi to a learned model distribution. This function captures the combined effect of model architecture, training objective, and optimization. The next generation's dataset is formed by mixing model-generated data with previous data. For theoretical analysis, we often consider the extreme case where the dataset is fully synthetic. If collapse occurs even in this simplified setting, it indicates a fundamental instability. At this point, it is natural to ask whether model collapse is simply a consequence of imperfect models. This slide shows that the answer is no. Even when we assume exact functional approximation, meaning the model perfectly represents the learned distribution, model collapse still occurs. This tells us that collapse is not primarily caused by insufficient model capacity or expressivity. Instead, it is fundamentally driven by the data generation process itself, especially finite sampling. Under these assumptions, the probability estimates for each discrete state from a martingale process. This means that in expectation, the estimated probability of each event remains unchanged across generations. However, this does not imply stability. While the expectation is preserved, the variance increases over time, which is the key source of instability in recursive training. Because sampling is finite, the generational process becomes a discrete state Markov chain. In such chains, absorbing states naturally arise. In this context, absorbing states correspond to probabilities collapsing to either 0 or 1. Once a state reaches zero probability, it is never sampled again and cannot recover. This is mathematical origin of irreversible diversity loss. This example makes the intuition concrete. Suppose a simple distribution assign probability 0.6 to the sentence I go to school and 0.4 to I go to lab. With infinite samples, these proportions are preserved. But with a small sample size, however, it is possible to sample only I go to school. Once this happens, the alternative sentence disappears entirely from future generations. This is an observing state. This behavior is known property of observing Markov chains. Such chains are guaranteed to reach an observing state in a finite number of steps. Applying to recursive dataset generation, this means that diversity loss is not an anomaly, but it is an expected outcome. An important result follows from this analysis. The probability that a particular state ultimately survives is exactly equal to its initial probability. Frequent patterns are likely to persist and rare patterns are likely to vanish. This formally explains why recursive training systematically eliminates the long tail of distribution. The theoretical conclusion is clear. Recursive dataset synthesis preserve frequent content while eliminating rare content. Over time, this process collapses the distribution toward a single dominant mode for its training trajectory. In other words, recursive training destroys diversity by construction. This theory directly applies to modern large language model pipelines. Many pipelines follow a loop of distillation, retraining, and resampling. Each iteration weakens the long tail of the distribution, and reduced diversity is therefore an early warning signal of impending model collapse. Model collapse is not limited to discrete language distributions. Even continuous distributions such as multidimensional Gaussians exhibit similar collapse behavior under recursive sampling. This shows that collapse is a general statistical phenomenon, not an artifact of tokenization or language modeling. The theoretical predictions are supported by experiments. In this setup, OPT 125 million is trained on Wikitext 2 across multiple generations. Each generation is trained on data generated by the previous model with control mixing ratios. Several consistent patterns emerge from this experiment. First, models generate progressively less realistic data. Second, generated outputs increasingly concentrate on sequence that the original model already assigned high probability. Third, mixing even a modest amount of real human data significantly mitigates collapse. This result closely matched the theoretical predictions. Follow-up work at Column 2024 examined how severe model collapse can be even in simplified settings. With a small vocabulary and short sequence lengths, collapse trajectories become visually apparent within a few generations. This analysis confirmed that the collapse is not a corner case, but it is a general statistical outcome. Introducing real data changes the dynamics. Even a small fraction of real data induces a mean reverting drift, pulling the learned distribution back toward the original data. This provides a concrete mechanism for preventing collapse through continual data accumulation. More recent work introduced the concept of strong model collapse. In this regime, even 0.1% synthetic data is sufficient to trigger collapse under certain conditions. This result challenges the assumption that small synthetic fractions are always safe. Under strong model collapse, traditional scaling laws also fail. Increasing dataset size or model size no longer guarantees improved performance. In some cases, scaling actually accelerates the collapse. This figure visualizes collapse boundaries across different synthetic dataset size. Regions without collapse are increasingly constrained. This highlights how fragile large-scale training becomes under recursive data generation. A particularly counterintuitive finding is that larger models collapse faster. Larger models are better at concentrating probability mass on dominant modes, which accelerates tail elimination. Scale amplifies collapse rather than preventing it. One practical implication is the need for data governance. Separating pre-AI era data from model-generated data becomes critical. Techniques such as watermarking and provenance tracking may be necessary to prevent uncontrolled recursion. This raises a natural question: is model collapse inevitable? Recent work suggests that it is not, provided the training process is carefully designed. One solution is data accumulation. Instead of replacing old data with synthetic data, real data is continuously accumulated. This ensures that the grounding distribution never disappears. Another approach is synthetic data verification. Generated samples are filtered or validated before entering the training set. Without verification, synthetic data quickly leads to collapse. With verification, scaling synthetic data becomes possible. So far, model collapse has been framed as a failure mode. However, recent work proposes a different perspective. Model collapse can sometimes be useful. In machine unlearning, partial model collapse can be deliberately induced. By repeatedly training on selected responses, unwanted information can be forgotten without explicit optimization of unlearning targets. In this sense, controlled collapse becomes a tool rather than a bug. Model collapse typically progresses through stages. Early on, the long tail disappears. In the middle stage, generalization degrades. In the late stage, the distribution converges to a delta-like form. Model collapse raises several open questions. Are modern LLMs already collapsing toward benchmarks rather than real-world distributions? How should we evaluate models trained under recursive data generation? And what data infrastructure is required to support long-term training without collapse? Thank you for listening. This concludes the presentation on model collapse.